Okay, so, okay, here we go. All right, so my name's Greg Harper. I teach here at HCH Institute, and I was a professor for most of my life in geology. And this is partly my story about how I get from being a scientist, and I was an atheist, and how I end up doing something like shamanism, which is basically a spiritual practice, but it's not necessarily non-scientific. So I graduated with a PhD from Berkeley when I was 26 years old. I was sort of a super overachiever. I've published many research papers and I've traveled extensively in my research. But I always felt like it wasn't quite my true calling. And in 2003, I took a weekend workshop at the Omega Institute with Sandra Ingerman, which was an introduction to shamanism. And I kind of took it out of like boredom. I didn't know what to do. And my sister had a catalog for the Omega Institute, and I thought, well, that sounds interesting. And I went in with absolutely no expectations, not knowing very much about it. And that one weekend literally changed my life. Because as you'll see, in shamanic journeying is where you actually, with drumming, go off into what we call traditionally other worlds. And you meet with non-physical beings we call spirits. And so it was, of course, I was wondering, is this real? Is it not real? That's always a common question when you're first starting. But I sure liked it. And it's strange, it kind of felt like a true calling. So in 2004, I actually ended up retiring early from being a professor and moving out here. And I came back to the Bay Area because I wanted to go to this school in hypnotherapy, because shamanism is a part of the hypnotherapy training, and I teach that part now and some other parts of hypnotherapy. And then I started the shamanic training program here about 6 years ago, and I have 2 groups doing that now. This was not an easy transition to go from being a scientist to doing shamanism, and because standard science says nothing spiritual exists, basically. It's the standard scientific narrative. It's actually quite closed to that. And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit. And also I'm going to be showing you a few videos, which for anybody who's really skeptical, once you watch these videos, you have to know that something is going on beyond standard physical reality. And there's actually a lot of excellent scientific research on these things, very high quality. So just a little bit about, really what is science. To me, it's the study of the natural world. It's basically physical reality for the most part. It's based on objective observations resulting in hypotheses, or just a hypothesis is just a mental construct, the way we think the world might work. And then we constantly test it with new studies, getting new data. It's all very data-oriented observations. That's basically it. We interpret it. If you get enough information, it goes from a hypothesis to a theory. But ideally in science, we're ready to throw all those things out. In the ideal scientist is not attached to any hypotheses or theories, but of course we're human, so of course we get attached to them. But it's really only been around for a few hundred years. It's a true scientific method. Shamanism, on the other hand, has been around for tens of thousands of years. And it's just a very practical method for healing and obtaining information. It's practiced by all indigenous cultures. And it's surprisingly similar from continent to continent. And it's really based primarily on subjective experiences of the individual, the one who practices shamanism. And they actually enlist the aid of non-physical beings, which we call spirits, and they journey into what we call non-ordinary reality, which is non-physical reality. And the unique thing to shamanism is this thing we call the shamanic journey. And we'll be looking at that more. And I'm going to give you a chance to have one today if you haven't before. So there's really, in my opinion, there's really no conflict between science and shamanism. And many of the people who are best known in the modern shamanic movement and who have their own teaching programs in schools, such as Michael Harner and Sandra Ingerman, they come from science backgrounds. Michael Harner was an anthropologist studying in the Amazon, and Sandra Ingerman was originally a biologist, and then she went and became a a psychotherapist, and she took a weekend workshop like I did from Michael Harner to get an easy 2 credits when she was in graduate school, and look what happened to her. So many of these people who are teaching and doing shamanism actually come from a scientific background. And since we can actually obtain information through this shamanic journey, is called a path of direct revelation. That is, we can go and get answers from what we call helping spirits. And people who take my trainings ask me questions, and very often I say, well, do a shamanic journey on it, right? You can go get your own answer. I can give you an opinion, but you might as well go ahead and get your own answer. Now, if you look at religion and science, there's been tremendous conflicts, and there still are today with more fundamental religions, particularly if you want to use the Bible as a scientific book. There's all sorts of conflicts, starting with Galileo, the age of the Earth. I've actually done a lot of radiometric dating with radioactive isotopes, so you can't get around it. The Earth's pretty old. And then the Great Flood covered the Earth. We don't have evidence for that. A lot of other things just don't fit. There's still some people who argue that the Earth is 4,004 years old, as based on counting the number of generations in the Bible backwards. It's 4004 BC. And the person that originally did this, Bishop Usher, I think said it was at 11 a.m. on a particular date. He was very precise. Actually, in a way, it was a little bit scientific because he was using a method, but the assumption that the Bible is a historical or scientific document is one that, in modern science, of course, we find all sorts of evidence. That's not true. But if you think about religion, it's primarily about belief, and that's fine. Modern shamanism is not what I would consider a religion. It's actually just about having direct experiences. You go have your own experiences. You might wonder, is it real or not real? But they are your own experiences. And so rather than learning about someone else's experiences and having beliefs around it, you actually go and have your direct experience. And it's only through practicing doing shamanism that those of us who do it finally can validate the experiences, such as we can get accurate information on shamanic journeys. And we see, during shamanic healing, we see what might be called miracles. A miracle to me is just something we don't understand scientifically. I mean, anybody that saw a cell phone 200 years ago would think that's a miracle, right? Actually, healing of cuts is kind of miraculous, isn't it? Just kind of magically happens. So, what we call a miracle or not miracle really has to do with what we think we understand in science. So this is ideal science. We have an open mind. We have assumptions rather than beliefs. We're ready to throw away hypotheses and theories. And the basis of this is we get observation and we form hypotheses, which may eventually become a theory if we get enough data. But what we actually do as humans is we have experiences which include learning, and we get beliefs. And beliefs actually tend to be pretty rigid. They're kind of what make up our framework of our inner world. And, scientists are like every other human. We tend to get these beliefs. And you can get what's called scientific dogma, which is where most scientists hold these beliefs that actually may not be true at all. I'm going to give you an example in a minute of one. And of course, everybody defends their beliefs, right? And so scientists can get this way too. In fact, I would say there's a thing called scientific fundamentalism. Fundamentalism, you just won't take it in, right? Just ask any mainstream scientist to talk about astrology with you or about shamanic journeying. They just don't want to go there. But I'm going to show you, there are actually scientific studies of some of these things that show there's a real effect happening. So here's some common beliefs today in the scientific or medical community about depressions caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain, right? So there's a survey that said 85% of Americans believe that. Did you know there's actually no data that's ever been found to support that? It could be true, but there's no data whatsoever. They've dissected cadavers and done all sorts of measurements. They can't find it. And the fact that so many people believe it is really a testament to the effectiveness of marketing and advertising. Right? It was a good hypothesis back in the 80s. It's just there's never been any data to actually support it. Consciousness arises from the brain. That's a basic narrative of standard science, is the brain is the source of consciousness. And it's a little depressing because that means when the body dies, that's it, you're done. And there is actually a lot of scientific research, and I'll show a little bit of it, that suggests this is not true at all. But it is a very standard thing. And it seems to make sense because you injure the brain, it seems like consciousness changes. But you can also think of the brain more like a receiver and transmitter. The other one, near-death experiences, skeptics just are always saying things like there's oxygen deprivation in the brain, things like that. And I'll give you an example where that can't possibly be true for a near-death experience. It's interesting that people that actually have them say it's more real than real, and their lives are often completely changed. So it's a subjective experience again. And then there's the one about heart attacks are caused by bad cholesterol, which probably most people, most doctors believe. But the new research is suggesting they probably got that one completely wrong. And by the way, if people take cholesterol-lowering drugs, even if they're helpful, one thing to keep in mind is 1/4 of all the cholesterol in your body is in your brain. If you're called a fathead, that's actually quite true. The brain is mostly fat. So I don't know about you, but I don't really want to be lowering something that's my brain's largely made of. And I think within the next 5 or 10 years, you're going to see that make it into the mainstream. So some of these scientific theories are medical things that just seem like common knowledge, and I just want to remind you, a theory or hypothesis is actually a mental construct. It's something we make up. And it's a model for how the world works. And some of these turn out to be completely wrong, spectacularly wrong, just complete. But the strength of science is there is a willingness eventually to let go of these constructs and create new ones. But it can take more than 10 years on average for that to happen. And I read recently there's a study in medicine that takes 14 years from clinical research in medicine where things are well documented to make it down to your average practitioner. It might be a little scary. Your average doctor is 14 years out of date. And I certainly found this a few years ago. I was asked to teach community college on kind of an emergency basis for a few weeks. And I happened to be teaching my specialty. And I'd done a lot of research in it. And it turns out the textbook they were using, about 1/4 of what I was teaching was wrong. It's absolutely not correct. The research had clearly shown it's incorrect, but it hadn't made it down to the textbook yet, right? And that was about at least a 10-year delay. So your average textbook's out of date too. This is just the way humans work. Your researcher, your average teacher or a doctor just doesn't suddenly get all the new stuff because they're very busy and they're doing what they've been doing, and it just takes a while for it to make it down to your average practitioner. The interesting thing I found, though, when I was teaching the community college I hadn't taught college for about 10 years, I really had a different perspective because these ideas that we teach and we test students on, many of them actually are theories, but they start believing them, right? And so in a sense, I started to see that education in some ways can be indoctrination, right? I think that's just something important to kind of keep in mind. And if I were using the textbook I wanted to use, it'd be very process-based, where you look at case studies and here's the data, here's the interpretation. Maybe it's not the right interpretation. But instead, we tend to teach things as if they're fact. And we may know at the professors they're not facts, but the students kind of get that idea. So I'm going to give you an example that's very well known from my own field, geology. And one of the things that happens in science is if there's no explanation or hypothesis to explain something, scientists tend to throw out the data, which is kind of bad science. You don't want to throw out data, right? But it happens all the time. I mean, just take astrology, for example, and I'm not going to try and convince you it's true or not true, but the typical thing is, how could the position of the planets make any difference on anything, right? And so you just throw it out. Yet most of my students get a reading from someone who's actually has a PhD in Jungian mythology, kind of puts, and everyone, including me, says the information he has from a birth chart is actually quite accurate. And, you know, I'm looking for things that aren't accurate, and virtually everything you read in there is right on target. So that's data. If it happens over and over, you have to start thinking, well, maybe there is something to that. But you could say maybe not. But the important thing is just to be open-minded about it. So here's a spectacular one of something being thrown out. So here you can see, I'm sure you're all familiar, if you put Africa and South America together, they match. And the shorelines kind of match, but if you actually take the edge of the continental shelves, they match quite precisely. And you see that little joke there? It says, I'm breaking up with you. It's continental drift. It turns out you can put virtually all the continents back together, and they fit quite well with a few exceptions. Like Mexico doesn't quite fit in things, but we have explanations for that now. This was actually proposed around 1915. It was proposed by a German meteorologist. He wasn't a geologist. He was interested in climates, and you can get information from past climates from rocks. He made some very persuasive arguments that the only way you would explain occurrences of ancient glacial deposits and there's some tropical deposits the same age is it only work if you put all the continents together. But he had kind of a Donald Trump personality, you know, very strong-willed, and said not very nice things to geologists about what they were doing. And so people didn't really want to go with that anyway, but it was highly debated. But then around 1930, there was a big international meeting, and they said, well, there's no way these continents can plow through ocean crust, which was known to be quite strong. I mean, how could they possibly move through ocean crust, right? So they threw it out completely. New data came in 1960s, early 1970s, which basically proved continental drift. It was modified into something I'm sure you've heard of called plate tectonics. And the oceans are completely differently than anyone imagined. So it's very interesting. I was an undergraduate in the Midwest at a school. I graduated in 75, and we weren't taught plate tectonics, or we got a little bit, and they said, well, it's just an idea. Then I came to Berkeley, which was one of the hotbeds of the research, and you know, this had been accepted for 5 years, and we learned all the data for it. So you can see already there's a 5-year gap just from the Midwest to the coast. So every textbook now has plate tectonics in it. And in fact, you can measure continental drift directly now. You can use very high precision GPS. You can see the continents moving. It's only like half an inch a year, something like that, but they're definitely moving. So we're all making mental constructs of the world. In science, that's what we call hypotheses and theories, but we do that without even realizing it. We have an inner world that's a model for the real world. It's kind of like a map. We have maps for everything inside us. And there's a famous saying that the map is not the territory. We can really confuse them. And maps can be accurate, but they're still not the territory. Now, when I was a naive graduate student, I thought maps were really accurate, these topographic maps made by the U.S. Geologic Survey. And I was working in kind of a wilderness area up in far northern California. My wife dropped me off at the headwaters of a creek, and it was 8 miles down to the mouth of the creek where she was going to pick me up. And she had to drive 23 miles around to get that 8 miles. It was very remote. And so she drops me off. I start going down this creek, and the map shows it's just kind of a nice smooth gradient on this creek. It was about 2,000 feet down, quite a bit. And after half an hour, I hit this really tall waterfall. And it didn't look like I could get down. My wife had already left. How am I going to get out? And I actually decided it's the most dangerous thing I ever did in all my years of field work is I climbed down the face of this waterfall, which was quite wet. And I had to jump about the last 15 feet. But I'd watched parachute jumpers, and I knew you should bend your knees and roll. So it was on gravel. I was fine. And I had an altimeter. It was 105 feet straight down. Wasn't on the map. I thought, wow, I'm glad I'm past that. And I go another mile, and there's another one that was 95 feet. But I could get down that one pretty easily. So I learned pretty early that maps can be inaccurate, but our inner maps can be inaccurate as well. We're going to look at some of our inner maps. So you can think of a map just now. If you want to close your eyes, just think of the person you most admire. You know, could be the Dalai Lama, could be your partner. You know, could be someone you know, someone you've just read about. And if you think about that person, you think what they look like, what they sound like, what you like about them. And now if you open your eyes, notice they're not here, right? So what were you just visiting? It was actually a map of that person. Now, is that map accurate? Well, it's hard to know unless you get more information, right? And some people who tend to be very spiritual and holy turn out to do things that aren't very much like that. And it turns out our maps are inaccurate, right? Just think we can fall in love. We have a map, this person is the ideal person, but then they do something that doesn't fit our map. And we go, oh my God, you've changed or something. Or maybe we just don't, our map's inaccurate, right? So these beliefs are obviously what we hold to be true. They're kind of the skeleton of that inner world. And we really tend to defend them to keep our inner world intact. And you might have a sense, why do we want our inner world to be stable and intact? Well, if it keeps changing, if it turns out to be inaccurate, it can be very kind of disturbing, right? And so usually our beliefs don't change really fast. I think when we're young, we can change them really fast. And the reason I think that's because of Santa Claus, right? Do you remember when you learned there wasn't a Santa Claus? It was sad, but it wasn't that big a deal, right? Let me tell you, as an adult, if you believed in Santa Claus, it'd be really hard now. Adults, we have a much harder time changing our beliefs. And being a scientist, we get beliefs in science, even though we don't think we do. And it can be really difficult when we get information that the belief's not true. I can tell you, there was a lot of geologists that weren't very happy with the plate tectonics, but the data got so overwhelming, finally the whole field switched. Sometimes big scientific changes, and actually you got to wait for the older generation to die off, before it to really take hold. So here's a couple mental constructs. This is of God, right? You probably have a mental construct of God. It can be a very complex one, right? But the upper one is the standard mental construct of God, all through the Middle Ages, and he's a guy there, he's an old man, right? That's a mental construct, right? Might be accurate, but whatever, it's a map, whether it's accurate or not accurate. The lower one's more of a New Age one, maybe God's the universe, But a lot of other constructs, but it could be God has no form. It's indescribable. It's everywhere, permeates everything. That's another one, but that's a hard one couldn't get a slide of that, right? Because there's no form. But I did find a mental construct I think is really accurate. So see what you think. Here we go. So the joyful, loving, eternal, forgiving nature of dogs never tipped you off. I mean, there's another big clue, right? What's dog spelled backwards? God, right? It's really obvious the whole time. So changing beliefs which hold our inner world together is actually usually pretty difficult unless you have a really powerful experience. Traumas can do that. You can be have a strong religious sense of things, but then you almost die, and then you kind of go, well, where was God? Some people lose their faith through traumas. That's a really big change in belief. Or you may feel you're really safe, and then you get mugged, and then you suddenly don't feel you're safe. That's a change in belief. Near-death experiences often change people's beliefs profoundly. They may even be atheists, and they come back and they have this strong belief. They're really, is an afterlife or God. You can do, in shamanism, some people do psychotropic plants, and ayahuasca is the strongest of these, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. That is so powerful, it can actually end up changing your beliefs. So they can also change when you get new information, new experiences, but it's usually slower, you know. So my journey was, in my first weekend workshop in shamanism in 2003, and I did a lot of workshops and trainings, advanced trainings in shamanism. It's definitely felt something I really wanted to do as a profession. And I had enough experiences where I could know I was getting accurate information. And ideally, as a scientist, I had the data to show these things really do exist, yet I was constantly doubting it. And as one of my teachers, Michael Harner, said, it's good to be skeptic. He just says, do the work, see what happens. But it was, I was having a hard time believing it, you know. So it's kind of, I had trained as a hypnotherapist here, and so I had a hypnotherapy practice, but I really wanted to do shamanism. But this difficulty in believing it was kind of preventing me from effectively practicing it as a profession, which I do now. So how did I get there? Well, in 2009, I actually started to see a psychotherapist to deal with what you call cognitive dissonance. You know, dissonance is like a cacophony, you got sounds all over the place. Cognitive dissonance is it's defined as a mental stress or discomfort experienced by someone who holds two or more contradictory beliefs, right? And then, so it's like, I had my scientific view of the world, which is really everything's physical. And then I had my shamanic point of view, that says there's a lot more than physical, right? And I'd be talking to her about this in each session. It's kind of helping to talk to her. And then one day I was sitting on a couch and she was on the other side, just like this. And then her father shows up. And one thing I really never wanted to believe in are ghosts. And this guy was sitting next to me, just as clear as Deborah is right now. And he was yelling in my ear, saying, tell her I'm here, tell her I'm here, tell her I'm here. So I go, okay, here's the problem. I tell the therapist, it seems like there's a guy here saying it's your father. And he has a message for you. She goes, oh, okay. She's very calm about it. See what he has to say. So he kind of came into me and I just said something and then he left. But, I'm doubting the whole thing about what's going on and things. It was nice. She said I was about the most sane person she ever saw, because sometimes I started to wonder. But, they're licensed therapists. They're not supposed to tell you anything about their life, right? I finally got her a couple of months later. I asked her, I said, has your father died? And she says, yes. I said, the message makes sense. She said, yes. So at least I kind of got some feedback on that. I deal with ghosts all the time now. I just, I just have so much experience with it. But that was the first one I just was really having a hard time. So I did decide to do an ayahuasca ceremony in 2010. I want to say right off the bat, I don't recommend you go looking for this stuff. It's extremely powerful. I've known 2 people who have been disabled by it where they couldn't work anymore. It kind of depends who's doing the ceremony. It would want somebody who's very experienced, ideally trained with native shamans. And probably the best place to do it would be actually in the Amazon, where you can actually work with the Amazon shamans. So it's almost as if it came and found me, that the information about the ceremony, because it's not really legal in the United States, although might fall under that religious ceremony sort of thing. But it's all underground and things. But it came through a very unusual source. And so I decided to go ahead and do it. And even though I have a ponytail, I've never done like psychedelic drugs or anything, because I grew up in Nebraska and even pot was a felony and they actually enforced it. So I never really got into any of that. So this was actually my first experience with anything like this. And so you take this tea, which comes from this vine. The vine's this double vine, which actually kind of looks like DNA, interestingly. And the thing about ayahuasca is most people really get sick. You throw up a lot. And boy, I really did, like for an hour nonstop. It's kind of a purging, and like every aspect of my personality I had to let go. You know, I didn't realize how much arrogance I had as a scientist. You know, if I didn't know it, some other scientist knew it, and boy, it just got rid of all that. It's very humbling in a good way. And the plant, and see, I'm seeing all these patterns like on the right. Most people see these very fractal type, beautiful geometric patterns. For me, they're kind of moving like curtains and things. And but at one point when I was getting really sick, I was really saying I really want to do shamanism, and it's almost trying to get me to give it up. And I just really had to say, no, this is what I really want to do. And the plant actually talked to me. It was female. Everybody seems to find it's female. And it said, this isn't your path. You should do drumming. I was kind of thinking, good. I'd rather do drumming. And a very interesting thing happened because I had a hypnotherapy practice. I did just a little shamanism. And within a month, my entire practice shifted almost entirely to shamanism. No marketing, anything. Just people started to call me up and wanted me to do shamanic work for them. So one of those curious things that happened. In 2012, my wife was diagnosed with cancer. I was really, if you ever have that happen, you feel kind of helpless. You don't know what to do. And I decided to do another ayahuasca journey on her behalf to see if I could get some guidance on that. This experience was very different. Because as soon as it didn't work, nothing happened. I had to take another dose and everything. And then next thing I know, this huge, look just like this huge anaconda comes up and it wrapped around me and said, remember, this isn't your path. And then it squeezed me, and that's when I vomited all the ayahuasca. So I didn't actually go into much of a altered state because it was helping me get rid of it. But just at the very end, I got like whispered a little message, which was just a deeply profound message about how I could help my wife. And it was so it was quite, so both ceremonies for me were very helpful, but I'm certainly not going to go looking for this for me. A lot of young people really want to do ayahuasca rather than do like shamanic training and things. You know, it's a very different path. So I want to talk a little bit more about kind of like parapsychology type stuff, because this really gets to the basic thing: is there something? Is there life beyond death? Are there ghosts? All this sort of thing that standard science says doesn't exist. That partly is a historical thing because there was so much conflict between science and the church in the early days of modern science that it was kind of decided the church handles everything spiritual and science handles everything physical, and you should never really go together. So there is this long history of it. But in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were some very, very famous scientists, some of them Nobel Prize winners, mostly in Britain, but some here in the United States. And they decided these things were so commonly reported that it's important to investigate it. And this is back in the days of seances, right? Everybody was having seances. And so they were investigating all these things. And they formed these things called the British and American Psychical Societies. The American one was led by no other than William James, which was Henry James, the author's brother, who started the first psychology department in the country at Harvard, very highly respected philosopher. And all these scientists caught so much flack for doing this from other scientists. Now, what they did find is almost all of the psychics and the seances were frauds. Probably 95% were actually fraudulent. But they did find 5% that were actually providing verifiable information coming from psychic sources. And the very interesting thing is after about 40 or 50 years, some of these members started dying off, and then they started sending these very complex messages through 3 different psychics on 3 different continents. You had to put all the messages together. It's almost like on the other side, they're trying to help them prove that life really does exist. beyond it. But if you're interested in that history, this is a great book called Ghost Hunters. And I think it's written by someone that doesn't believe in any of this stuff, but it's a very nice, well-documented history of that. This is going to be this is my favorite YouTube video. And the researcher in this is Rupert Sheldrake. And he's a very well-known British researcher, but he gets attacked a lot because he's decided to study things like telepathy. Because most people actually experience things like a sense somebody's staring at you and then you turn around and somebody is, or telepathy is actually where you get thoughts from other people, right? And he set up all sorts of experiments to test them. So he's the guy you've probably heard about who tested whether dogs know when their owners are coming home. And he would put a video camera on the dog, and then he'd have the owner out someplace, and then he would page them and say, it's time to come home. And as soon as the person got the page message, over half the dogs would actually run to the door, wagging their tail. And this is way, way above chance. Now, about 30% of cats did, but that kind of makes sense, right? Because cats don't really care whether you're coming home or not, for the most part. So I'm going to show you this experiment he did. It's not his main part of his research, but he knew somebody who had this parrot. And this parrot seemed to be able to read the thoughts of the owner. And so he said, well, let's go ahead and test this. Let's see if there's anything to this. And the really curious thing about this parrot is it actually can speak. There's a number of parrots. There's one, Alex the parrot, or Gray, Alex the Gray, you may have heard of. A psychologist studied him for years. And he actually could speak, has grammar, vocabulary, 400 or 500 words. I mean, this is very, and you're going to see this, very strange. It sounds like a person talking. And so let's just see what this comes across like.
Anyway, as a result of this, we decided to set up a large-scale controlled experiment. And in this controlled experiment, we had over 100 totally different photographs selected by a third party who was given a list of key words that Nkisi says. So we asked somebody else to pick images corresponding to a list of words we gave him that the parrot knew, and seal them in envelopes, and then shuffle the envelopes and number them. So they were in a random sequence. Nobody knew what was in each envelope. Each one contained a different picture that Amy and I didn't know about. In these experiments, we then Amy, we had two cameras with time codes on them. One camera filming the parrot continuously, the other one in a basement room with all the doors closed, so that it was a soundproofed room in which Amy was filmed on camera, opening these envelopes one by one and looking at each one for 2 minutes at a time. There was a beeper to tell her when the 2-minute period was over. And then after, the parrot, of course, didn't know she was doing this and received no feedback. So we then got 3 independent people to transcribe the tapes, and the transcripts agreed very well. And we've analysed it all statistically. The results are fantastically above chance. I mean, the odds against chance are thousands, even millions or billions, depending on the method you use, to 1. It's staggeringly significant telepathy results. What I'm going to do, the parrot didn't get it right every time. Sometimes it didn't say anything. Sometimes it spent the whole time of the test shouting to Amy to call her back because it didn't like her leaving the room. It said, come back, why are you growling with me? Because it thought she was absolutely annoyed with it because she'd walked out of the room without, for no apparent reason. But in the others, in many of the others, it did say exactly what she was looking at. I have a videotape here which shows some of these experiments. Now, this has hardly been seen before. I think this is one of the first public showings of this in the United States. And this video is rather hard to believe at first, because what you're going to see is the parrot speaking. We have subtitles which illuminate what the parrot says, because it's not always clear to people. It should be clear to you, but it was made mainly for British audiences. And because the parrot hasn't... The parrot has an American accent, so...
What year was this done?
This was done in 2000.
I've been working for several years to train my parrots to understand and use spoken language appropriately.
Due to their ability to communicate through meaningful speech, I discovered by accident that they seemed able to read thoughts. They would often describe vocally what I was looking at, reading, or even thinking that they could not have known of any other way. I had never done anything to try to train or reward them for this. They just seemed to do it as part of their expression of our bond. This was happening so frequently that Rupert Sheldrake and I decided to perform these controlled experiments to study it.
So the two cameras are side by side,
Love
and that
you.
card
See you
showed they
later.
were synchronized. Amy's
I'm gonna
now
go show you
taking
these
one
pictures,
camera
okay?
downstairs.
I want you to tell me. Hey, Mama! Mom! I want to show you.
That's the parrot talking. From now on, all the words you hear are the parrot.
You can put the tiger flow. See you later. I'm gonna go get some flowers. Yeah, your mother made it. Pick some flowers. Yeah, I go pick some flowers. You gotta go to camp and put flowers on that. You gotta put some pick some flowers. Just some pick some flowers. So, man, put a flower. Look at pick a flower. Yeah. Am I pretty? What's it doing up
Answering machine noise.
So cool. What's your bed up?
This is obscure. It's only, we'll have a close-up and you'll see what's going on.
Careful. It's not put your head out.
There's a guy's head out of the cab window, and that's what Amy was actually looking at when the parrot said you put your head out.
Oh, can I have your hug? Can I give you a hug? Your hug? Oh, tickle, tickle, tickle. Oh, I got you. Oh, I got you. Oh. Got you. Can I have a kiss? Okay.
Isn't that sweet?
Yeah.
So,
Have a kiss?
whoops.
Where do we get one?
So, like he said, in science, when we're looking at things, the way we decide whether they're real or not is we use statistics. And I have a pretty good statistics background. And he was saying there, the chances of this just being at odds, that this pair just happened, could guess every one, is like 1 in millions, And yet some people still say it's coincidence. But really, the data suggests really something. Here's just a little graph about the sense of being stared at. This is from Dean Radin's book, Entangled Minds. And that graph on the left just shows the hit rate. That means how accurate someone actually guesses they're being stared at. The bottom there is 50%, which would be random. Half the time you guess one way or the other. And on the lower part of the graph is the number of studies, and you can see there's like about 60 studies of this being done. I mean, it's just a huge amount of data. Each dot is the average of each study, and the little lines are the uncertainty. And you can see it's very consistent through these studies. And it's about 54%, which is so much more than half. And a skeptic might say, well, that's not that much more than guessing. But in fact, statistically, the chances of this being just by coincidence is 1 in 202 octocillion to 1. That's a very large number. It's like a trillion, 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 which is basically, you have to say that's basically true. So the results of studies like this are really that this is a real thing. And probably all of you have experienced this, right? Yet standard science, mainstream science will deny this, and they really just won't look at this sort of data. Now, one of the most fascinating things are children who remember past lives. They usually do it between the age of 2 and 7. By the age they're 7, they have forgotten. Mothers have had children, they're washing them and they're 3 years old, and says, Mommy, I remember when I used to do this when you were my daughter, or something like that, And in our country, of course, we just think that's cute, don't pay attention to it. But in countries where they believe in reincarnation, they do actually kind of pay attention to it. And there's this professor at the University of Virginia, Ian Stevenson, who actually had a career studying these children who remember past lives. Now, there are some American cases. Well, most of them were in India and Thailand. He had a network of people that would call him. And he was really, really stringent about it. If there's any chance this child could have gotten this information through the family or something, he would completely throw it out. So he studied 2,500 cases, and 1,200 of them were objectively verified. And these kids, some of these kids remember the town they grew up, which might be 100 miles away. They remember names, all their friends, families, everything. Sometimes they take the child. In India, there's lots of people in the room, right? And the child runs right up to who had been the wife of the person they remember being and starts scolding them or things, I mean, they know the names of everybody in the room. I mean, it's really quite remarkable. And so these are real scientific, studies. And then he had a subset of 35 that had these very distinctive birthmarks. And the person the child remembered being had died in a way that corresponded to the birthmarks. There's one had these very strange birthmarks, these dots around the chest. And the person who remembered dying was killed with a shotgun blast to the chest. And there's another one who was shot in the back of the neck and had a birthmark here, had a birthmark here. This birthmark was larger because the exit wound is larger. So that's makes you kind of think about birthmarks a little bit differently. So I want to show you this video of a well-known case, American case. He didn't study it, but the father was a very conservative Christian and wasn't going to have anything to do with this past life stuff. So he worked for 5 years to try and disprove his little boy's memories of being a fighter pilot in World War II. And he basically ended up proving it. So let's watch this.
There you go.
11-year-old James Leininger looks and acts like most boys his age, but beneath his playful spirit is a very deep soul.
And I said, I'm really glad you're my son. I just really
fun to have you as my son. And he says, I know, that's why I picked you.
When we first met Bruce, Andrea, and James in 2005, his passion for World War II fighter planes was obvious.
I can beat the Japanese easy as pie.
The fascination began when he was a toddler. James seemed intimately familiar with the aircrafts.
He started doing these little drawings of airplanes shooting at other airplanes or being shot down. Bombing ships, you see men parachuting. Here's another one where planes are dropping bombs. This is a carrier.
The violent drawings were followed by extreme night terrors.
He would just be crying. He'd say, airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out. He laid on his back and kicked up at the ceiling, and he goes, Mama, the little man's going like this. And he laid on his back and kicked his feet up. The little man's going, ooh, 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 can't get out. And I said, well, who's the little man, baby? And he goes, me. I thought Bruce and I were just going to faint.
They questioned, what kind of plane?
Corsair.
Why did your airplane crash?
My plane was shot down.
Who shot your plane?
He looked at me like I was a village idiot. He said,
The Japanese.
where did he take off from a boat?
Do you remember the name of your boat? He said Natoma.
And his name?
He always said James, but his name is James.
Stunned by his son's words, Bruce tracked down veterans of the USS Natoma Bay.
I wanted to disprove it.
Columbus, Ohio native Leo Pyatt served on the ship.
He asked a few questions about, did I know some of the people? Oh, yeah, I remember those people. Yes, there was a Jim Houston, or rather large shell. Just hit him in the engine, and it burst into flames and went down.
It was all real. James Houston, born and raised in the Midwest, was shot down over Chichijima, Japan.
He got very quiet.
The Leiningers were speechless again when James met Natoma Bay veterans and recognized them by name.
You're Bob Greenwald. I'm serious.
He'd never met Bob Greenwald.
No, he'd never met him before.
They tracked down James Houston's sister, Ann.
And he goes, it's not Ann, it's Annie. She wasn't my oldest sister. I had an older sister than that. And I said, you did? Who was that? And he goes, Ruth. I mean, Ruth.
Annie is what they called me when I was little. Knowing my name and my sister's name, the things that my brother did when he was a kid, it's too amazing to describe.
James recalled his favorite childhood possessions, and when we spoke to them via Skype, they shared one specific story involving James Houston's mother.
Annie had sent James the picture that her mother had painted of James Houston. And when James got it, he called Annie to thank her, and he said, where's the one Mom painted of you? And so she went and found it and sent a copy, and later on she told us that no one in the world except her brother and sister knew that there was an identical picture of Annie when she was the same age.
Amazing stories like that caught the attention of Japanese filmmakers. Not long after our story aired, they flew James and his entire family to Chichijima, Japan, and the site of James Houston's plane crash.
Took a tour of the island, got up on a ridge overlooking the harbor. James said, this is where the planes flew in the day my plane was shot down.
Without any help, James knew exactly where the plane crashed. They held a memorial service and dropped flowers over the wreckage.
And James just got so emotional and just lost it. And it was just the most heart-wrenching thing.
But when it was over,
it was cathartic.
You know, it still gives me goosebumps to think that we actually got there and we were there and we were able to close the loop, especially for James, that it was something really important to him.
And when they returned, the death and destruction pictures were replaced with this.
There's dolphins and there's the Japanese ship has its flags flying.
At James's urging, they put all of this and many more incredible stories on paper and published this new book, Soul Survivor.
I hope that it helps people understand the meaning of how precious life is, how fast it can just blow away.
The Leiningers say they aren't promoting reincarnation. Before James, they didn't believe in it.
And I really believe that there's a purpose to this story and that the God that created us wants this story told.
And I also hope that it opens people's eyes up to reincarnation.
You do?
Yeah, I hope it opens people's eyes up to the fact that reincarnation can happen. It is a possibility. It's not a lie.
Suzanne Stratford, Fox 8 News.
So that the book really details the thing very nicely, but that's a good American example. But again, Ian Stevenson, he documented 1,200 of these cases. Now, the near-death experiences, that the skeptics say are oxygen deprivation in the brain's basically hallucinating. Well, this is one of the most interesting near-death experiences of this woman, Pam Reynolds. Now, Pam Reynolds had an aneurysm in her brain and it could not be operated on. So they devised this thing where they would actually operate on her in a refrigerated room, and they drained all the blood out of her body. And they stopped her heart, obviously. And she was completely flatlined, no brain waves, no nothing, for hours. And nevertheless, she had a near-death experience. But part of the near-death experience is she actually left her body, and for a while, she was hovering in the room looking down at the surgeons. And when she came back, they brought her back to life. She was able to describe these very peculiar instruments being used in the surgery and also the conversations that went on. These are completely verified by the surgeons. And they don't know, they're kind of mystified about it, but they said, yes, that's actually correct. And there was no way she could possibly have known any of that information. So there are some cases you absolutely can't do it. And one of the most famous recent ones are by Eben Alexander, who is a neurosurgeon himself, more or less an atheist. And he had one of the most complete near-death experiences there were. And his brain was totally gone. He had bacterial meningitis. And he wrote a book called, I think it's Proof of Heaven. But that's very interesting if you want to look into that. And that completely changed his life. Now, another thing that's very well documented is something called remote viewing, which is really just a nice way of saying spying, psychic spying. And this was done by the military and the CIA. They had a group of people. As I recall, they heard the Russians were doing it, and they wanted to make sure there was nothing to it back in the 70s. And so they recruited some people, and they basically found out it really does work. And this is an example, for example. Let me just tell you what remote viewing is like. These people are in this little darkened room, completely sealed off from everything. The person who knows the target, for example, in the Soviet Union, that's where they would give them the targets for, they knew where the target was, but all they would do is just write 2 numbers on a piece of paper, and that's all they would give these remote viewers. They had no idea where in the world they were going to be viewing, and they would start sketching or drawing. And they averaged, the best people averaged about 80% accuracy, which is so far above chance. And this is an example of someone who did some remote viewing in 2000. This is after the secret program was done with. They finally closed it down, but it went for, I think, 24 years. It was supervised by Stanford physicists, and they've done all the statistics on it. This is really very well done research. And this is a site here in the lower part, which was a power plant in Wahoo. And the upper thing is a drawing someone had. Remember, all they were given were those numbers there in the upper right. And they were able to draw this, which is actually quite accurate. And I want to show you an example I'm going to show you a video of their best viewer, who's Joseph McMonigal, and who's written a number of books and things. And he had the highest success rate. On this particular one, he was essentially 100% accurate. And so let's just watch this. It's a short video.
Our priorities was Severodvinsk, a closed city at the heart of the Soviet armaments industry. In 1979, the CIA were desperate to know what was being built inside its enormous marine bunkers. The most sophisticated spy planes were useless against the walls of concrete, so the CIA called in a different kind of expert.
The National Security Council came to us and asked us if we would take a look at in the very northern part of the Soviet Union.
We were using coordinates at the time. So Joe had no idea what these coordinates meant, because even if they had looked at a map, we were interested in the buildings that are down there that don't show up in the map.
What was about to happen was extraordinary.
Looking in the building, remote viewing wise, I get an impression of lots of bright lights, two very large cigar shapes, and some unique welding methodologies. I had a sense that there were two very large hull shapes that were being welded side by side, which kind of threw me a little bit because I had never seen two hull shapes being put together like that. And basically, they're being put together this way.
What McMoneagle visualized appeared to be accurate. The shapes he described matched what the Russians really were building. An Akola-class submarine, the biggest in the world. But the US authorities were skeptical. John Alexander was commander of the US Intelligence and Security Command. He asked Marine engineers to assess McMoneagle's report. At first, they dismissed it.
That was truly spectacular. And again, it is a good example of our unwillingness to believe. What Joe had done is, of course, had spotted this unique submarine being built, and the information was passed to our boat builders, who just said, you can't do that. I mean, it's got to be nonsense, because anything that big, if it went down to depth, would be crushed. So we just discounted it because we didn't know how to do it.
But the naval experts were wrong. The Akola submarine turned out to be the ultimate weapon of mass destruction, capable of launching long-range missiles from any depth and carrying up to 200 nuclear warheads. It confirmed NATO's worst fears, that Russia was winning the arms race. The operation was a triumph, attracting government support for more PSI operations. It's still viewed as one of the best remote viewing experiments ever.
And so, in terms of shamanism, this is something that shamans have done for thousands of years. And what they do is they go into this altered state and they actually travel across the earth. And these tribes that lived particularly in desert areas, they would rely on the shaman to actually see where the herds were, see where the animals were, and then the people would go there. So their survival depended on it. I suspect the way that the Polynesians actually found these very remote islands like Hawaii and Easter Island was actually they may have been doing what we call these middle world journeys, or you can think of it as remote viewing, and actually seeing where the islands were rather than just randomly going out on big canoes and trying to find these places. So we can go now to like psychic mediums. You know, these are people who get information supposedly from people who have died. And usually the information they constantly say is everything's fine, I'm happy now. That's what they get. And you may know there's some very famous people like John Edward, Lisa Williams, some others who actually have had TV shows, and sometimes they're in front of an audience of 4,000 people. And when you watch those things, it's just pretty remarkable. And the one I found, if you want to watch on YouTube, who seems to be the most accurate is Gordon Smith from Scotland. He hits very high accuracy. Anyway, Gary Schwartz is a professor at the University of Arizona, and he's very much a Harvard and Yale type person. He trained at one and taught at the other. Very well-known researcher, and he got kind of interested in these sorts of things later in life. And University of Arizona gave him a position, and he set up his own center, which is funded by private money because the government won't fund this sort of research. And he decided to test psychic mediums. So he got 4 really well-known ones and one person he knew about that wasn't very well known. And he did his experiments. And there is this is on YouTube now. There's a documentary called, I think it's Life After Life. There's 2 documentaries that name, but if you search Life After Life, Gary Schwartz, you'll get the right one. It actually shows, this is from that video, it actually shows the mediums doing the readings. And they ended up being 80% accurate as well, which is far, far, far above chance. And when you watch the video, you'll see they're all reading a person. That screen you see is between the medium and the person being read, so they can't do a cold reading. And statistically, this means there's really something there. Now, this is one of the most amazing things. I'm going to show you a brief video of this. I'd read about this guy years ago, but when I saw that, it's much different when you actually watch a video of him doing this. Luis Gasparetto, he's a Brazilian medium, and he's also a psychotherapist. And in Brazil, they do a lot of what's called physical mediumship, and that's where you let the spirit come in and take over your body, basically. And you may know in Brazil, there are people who do this, and the spirits of doctors come in, and they will actually operate on people with no anesthesia, no disinfectants, anything. And these are actually quite well documented. They'll actually cut people open, take out tumors. They just seal the incision with their thumb. And and John of God is one you may have heard of that does these sort of things. But this guy, he channels artists, many, many different artists. And the amazing thing is he usually works in the dark doing this, and he'll have his eyes closed. It's dark anyway, and he's just doing like this. With one hand, 2 hands, he may be drawing with his foot or both feet at the same time. And he actually came here back in the late 70s to JFK University, and he did a demo. And the person I talked to said he watched him paint with 2 hands and 2 feet all at the same time. He makes these paintings in about 5 minutes. And he signs them, and the signatures are very accurate. And he does, all the Impressionists and Renoir, all these different artists. And the signature is always quite accurate. So I thought I'd show you a little video of this guy. This is a video from the 70s, and you'll see it's Telly Savalas. Remember him? Kojak? He's the one narrating.
Film crews flew from the Detroit-Windsor area into the part of the world noted for its psychics. Brazil. Luis Gasparetto has had famous artists from the past channel through him since the age of 13. Keep your attention on Luis. His eyes remain shut during the entire paintings. Using his opposite hand, Gasparetto begins another artist among the 44 that come through him. Recognize the familiar long neck and tubular face? Here's the signature. Modigliani. Amadeo Modigliani, born July 12, 1884, and died in 1920 at the age of 36. Two faces at once, a different artist in each hand. We asked Luis Antonio Gasparetto how all this began.
When I was 13 years old, they had a meeting home. We used to get together and pray together. And my father used to teach us spiritualism, metaphysics, reincarnation, and many things. In one of these meetings, I felt myself totally involved by a strange force, and I got paralyzed. And because of this, my mother felt that I was going in a sort of trance. So she decided to go with me in a psychic meeting, so the psychic couldn't see me and see what's going on with me. And they thought that I'd be right because I had a strong pain in my arms. And during the meeting, for my surprise, instead of writing, I started drawing. That was the first time that the painters approached me.
Gasparetto normally finishes a painting in 5 minutes and usually works in the dark, allowing lights only for this filming.
I play the music, and the music plays inside of me. And it's clear for me that my sensitivity is far from me. It's bigger. So everything that's inside of that field is inside of me. So the spirits approach, and I feel the spirits. I feel their personalities. I can see them. I can hear them. And when they think, in what they want to do, my body responds of what they think.
But let's see someone we all feel a closeness to. A style many of us recognize. Notice the spontaneity with which the colors are spread on the canvas. And now the technique, bizarre, almost comic. Good look. The broad, energetic strokes, the circular wisps of sky. Does it remind you of someone long ago? An old friend trying to say something? Vincent van Gogh, the first great Dutch master since the 17th century. Between 1888 and 1890, he produced his greatest pictures. Most of them landscapes filled with ecstatic movement. An extraordinary style from an extraordinary personality.
That's pretty interesting, huh? Whoops. So I want to talk to you just a little bit about my own experiences, some of the things I can't explain. So one of the things you probably know is about spoon bending. Some of you have done spoon bending, but it's like you take these things, and these are like no set spoon. These are really thick things, and I take it and I just can't do anything. Basically, you're doing a meditation, and then you can start bending, and you can really do some pretty spectacular things with this. And it's not really a good explanation for how that can happen. One of the things in the upper right, you see the peppers there. There's twice now after I've done workshops, I was able to eat the hottest hot peppers and not have any heat. And I'm normally very sensitive to that. So it's just fascinating. I just kept eating and go, that's kind of interesting. And then fire ceremonies, there was a fire ceremony I did at the end of a shamanic workshop, and the instructor said it's a friendly fire, we're burning something symbolic at, and he says, if you want, you can put your hands in the fire, it won't burn you. And the people in front of me are kind of going like that, and I go, well, I want to know. So I stuck my arms into this raging bonfire, and absolutely no heat, no singeing of the hair, nothing. And I was still a professor then, and my mind just shut down. I really couldn't process that, This is similar, I'm sure you all know about walking on coals, like Tony Robbins does. And, you might have heard recently there was like 7 people that got burned walking on coals, but he had 4,000 that weren't. So 7 that get the press, though. I think one of them was checking their cell phone right before they stepped on. It's not the idea. So let's now come to shamanism. Shamanism has been around for really thousands and thousands of years. You might wonder, what is a shaman or someone who practices shamanism? It's again, someone who actually can enter into what are traditionally called other worlds. If you want a modern sort of thing to call it, it would be parallel universes, that sort of thing. And you do it during an altered state of consciousness or a trance-like state if you want. And we go to these other worlds and we're interacting with these non-physical beings, which is the definition of a spirit. And it's for purposes such as healing, getting information. We can actually do communicating with the dead, which is kind of a little bit like being a medium. And again, the shamanic journey is this thing that's unique to shamanism. Now, the other thing we can do is we can actually call these helping spirits into our world, even though they don't live here, and they can assist us in healing. And one of the other things we do is we help people who have died to actually leave this world, or you might say cross over or go into the light. And these are some of my teachers in what's called core shamanism, started by Michael Harner, who worked in the Amazon. He wrote that classic book shown there called The Way of the Shaman. And Sandra Ingemann was my first teacher. She wrote the classic book on soul retrieval, which is one of the main types of healings we do. Nan Corbin and David Moss, I did a month-long training with them at Esalen. And core shamanism, Michael Hunter kind of looked at all the different cultures around the world and kind of boiled down to the things they have in common, which is actually a lot, and kind of refined it. And there's certain types of healing and practices done by all these different cultures. The other type of shamanism I've trained in is Peruvian shamanism, and the main person here is Alberto Velodo. He wrote this classic book, Shaman, Healer, Sage, and many, many other books. In fact, I learned about the painter you just saw. I learned about that from one of his early books. Danny Burling, I did a lot of my training in this with in Alberto's school. Well, he set up a school, and she's a graduate, and I learned most of it from her. And then actually took a workshop with this couple down below who actually live in a very, very remote village in the high Andes, no electricity, no roads, nothing. And so I got a workshop which came kind of straight from the source of indigenous shamans. And I've learned through reading from Hank Wesselman, and if you want to read some really interesting books, I'd suggest reading his. He's probably the most scientific sort of guy you'll ever meet. He also got his PhD from Berkeley, and he's done a lot of the research in East Africa on early hominids. He's been on a lot of those very big expeditions. He was spontaneously drawn into experiences. Usually he was in bed, and he would actually have kind of this thing happen, but he'd end up looking through the eyes and being within the body of somebody else. And this happened quite a number of times. And as he did it more and more, he learned that he was actually in the body of a man who was living 5,000 years in the future in California. It was tropical, and there was an inland sea where the Central Valley is now. And it was a fairly primitive culture, had some agriculture. And the man he was merged with actually did this journey which went over the Sierras to find where the Americans were. His ancestor was Hawaiian, and Hawaiians were living in California. They had migrated from Hawaii, and there's this big question about where the Americans were. And it's a fascinating story. It goes 3 books long. And the last book is about how this man he merged with was trained to be an Hawaiian shaman. And Hank Wesselman was trained to be an Hawaiian shaman while in the body of this man 5,000 years in the future, and it turned out to be quite accurate. And he's fully accepted now by the Hawaiian shamans. So it's really quite a remarkable story, and it wasn't easy for him. He was super academic. He didn't have any shamanic training or workshops or anything at the beginning. This just spontaneously happened, but he subsequently did various trainings. Now, in shamanism, we're taught not only by human teachers. When we learn to journey, we're actually taught by what you could call spirit teachers. They're in spirit form. So I have 3 main ones I work with. I primarily work with the middle one, which is a animal spirit. And in shamanism, almost every culture, a lot of the spirits we work with have animal form. And this painting by Susan Seddon Boulay, you're probably familiar, all these paintings are by her. This one of the jaguar is so interesting because when I first started working with it was in the black jaguar. After the ayahuasca ceremony, it turned into the normal orange jaguar. And I don't know if you can see on the right-hand side, kind of faintly, there's a woman's face with jaguar spots. And sometimes when I work with jaguar, it shows up as like a woman with spots. And it's interesting when I was making this talk, I found that painting, and I thought, well, that looks familiar. And they can communicate with us. These helping spirits are all knowing. They can do healing work. And then I also work with a couple spirits in human form, which sort of look like these. The one on the left seems to be in Mongolian. He says he's one of my ancestors, which always was confusing, but I found out Western Mongolia is actually Caucasian. The people are. And the one on the right is a Native American who never says anything, but he aids me in healing sometimes. And I've actually learned some of the things I now teach in shamanism, I've learned directly from them, rather than from human teachers. And I teach my students by the time they graduate, their teachers should be their helping spirits. So then we come to this thing unique to shamanism called the shamanic journey. It's a journey, it means you're going somewhere, right? So where are you going? Well, you can do these middle world journeys. The middle world is the world we live in, but there's an invisible spiritual side. And the remote viewing, for example, is a middle world journey. But then we also have the lower world, which almost everyone who goes there experiences it as a very beautiful, earthy, pristine earth, lots of animal spirits. And the upper world does seem kind of more heaven-like, at least in my experience. There are some very earth-like places. There's also these kind of places just with clouds and pastels. And when I once did a tour of the upper world, I even went to this place. There are kind of these crystalline cities, things like that. And of course, you may think, well, are those real or are you making them up? But that's a very valid question. This is where it's a very subjective experience. The curious thing is, shamans from different continents often describe the same places. And Michael Horner's group, Foundation for Shamanic Studies, I've read that they actually are having people journey and they actually map out these other worlds. They have a geography to them. So when you're journeying, you're meeting somebody, we're meeting these helping spirits, but sometimes we're going and we're meeting deceased loved ones, either pets or humans we've known. So one of the great things about shamanism is you can keep a relationship with people or pets who have died. And then how do you do it? There's a number of ways you can actually do a shamanic journey. The most common in about 90% of indigenous cultures is they use a rhythmic percussion. It's a very monotonous percussion of about 4 to 7 beats per second. About 10% of the cultures use these psychoactive plants like ayahuasca, peyote, mushrooms, things like that to aid in it. It's a very different experience than with drumming. You can actually ask for a dream before you go to bed, and sometimes you can actually have the experience in a dream. You know, most dreams seem to be pretty mundane and have something to do with what happened during the day that we're trying to work out. But you may have all had these dreams which are very different, what I would think are more spiritual dreams. And then I've also found you can actually journey with hypnotherapy. I'm also trained as a hypnotherapist, and I've had some of my most profound journeys actually under hypnosis. You know, a shamanic journey, we go into a trance state. In hypnotherapy, we help someone go into a trance state. To me, it's kind of the same state. And from a hypnotherapy point of view, the drumming is what we call a hypnotic induction. It puts you into that altered state. And why would you want to do shamanic journeys anyway? Huh? I do this strange thing. Well, you meet helping spirits, which is kind of nice to love you unconditionally. It's like an extended family. One of the main reasons we journey is get answers to questions. You know, like how will my life be if I retire early? I journeyed on that one. You can do it for healing. It's what shamanism is a path of healing. So when we work with people, we're journeying on their behalf. You can journey and ask I often, if I need healing, I journey to one of my helping spirits and they actually work on me. It's a really good deal. They don't charge me. It's like free. And then you can also journey to keep contact with those who have died. And it's not a bad idea to journey because it's really good for your health. There was a study where they studied a group of people did shamanic journeying. They measured their immune response in the saliva, and everyone's their immune response improved. It actually helps your health to do shamanic journeying. That may be true for meditation too. I don't know of any studies of that, but certainly in shamanic journeying, it's really good for your health. And the other one is just if you're curious, you can explore these other worlds. And to me as a scientist, finding out about these things and what we watch about videos about, you know, I'm a very curious scientist. I want to go experience those things rather than just push them away. So I'm going to actually guide you on your own journey, just a short little journey. I'm going to use kind of guided imagery with drumming, so you'll have your own experience. So anyway, on this shamanic journey, I'm going to invite you to close your eyes, and I'm going to guide you the whole way. But it's important you pick a place you really like that's on Earth. It could be any place in the world. And I'm going to invite you to let go of whether you think you're making it up or not. All right, and just have the experience. You know, even if you believe you're making it up, hey, you're still having a nice time. And so I'm going to invite you to just imagine standing on a path that leads to this place. You just need to decide where you're going to go, just a nice place in nature someplace. And imagine standing on a path that goes to that place. Feel your feet on the path. And as I count 1 to 10, just walk down the path, arriving at 10. Let each step take you deeper into relaxation. Taking the first step 1, deeper, relaxed. The next step 2, deeper, relaxed. Next step 3, deeper, relaxed. 4, next step 5, deeper, relaxed. 6, next step 7, 8, next step 9, almost there. 10, and coming into this place and just feeling your feet on the ground, and notice what it's like here. And what do you see, if anything? Not everybody sees on these journeys, but just notice what you do see, if anything. And what sounds do you hear, if any? What's the temperature like? You might feel a breeze or wind. And what do you smell, if anything? You may smell. Just letting all your senses be involved. Just enjoy being in this beautiful place. And if you have a favorite pet who's passed away, you might invite them to come join you. Sometimes your living pets want to come. You can invite them to be there. Now getting ready to return. As I count 1 to 5, coming on back up the path. So 1, starting up the path. 2, 3, 4, and 5. Coming on back. Okay, so when you're ready, coming on in and opening your eyes and coming back. So that was just a quick little journey, but hopefully you kind of got an idea of what it's like. You probably felt yourself getting in somewhat of an altered state. And it gets easier and easier with practice, but some people are really good at it right away. I do encourage you, if you're interested in shamanic journeying, this is the book I recommend for those who are starting journeying. It's called Journey to the Sacred Garden, and where I took you is like to a sacred, it's a garden, just a nice place you like to go. By Hank Wesselman. He's the one that, had those experiences 5,000 years in the future. So this comes up a lot, particularly people are more scientific or analytical. They always ask, well, yeah, it was nice going to that place, but was it real? And the truth is, you really don't know probably, right? But what happens is when you do this work enough, you actually get information that tells you there is some reality going on. Just like in the remote viewing, statistically, they could document things happening. So I want to just give you a few experiences I've had doing shamanic journeys that's really shown me some very interesting things. So in that first weekend workshop I took, we are doing a journey where you take a question to an animal spirit and you ask it for an answer. So I went on this journey, and this wonderful dolphin shows up, with a big smile and everything, kind of laughing. I was in a little bay, and I was standing there, and I got this invitation to actually merge with it and become the dolphin. So we went swimming out. I was as a dolphin. I'm jumping in the air like this one here, having a great time. And then but my question was, what's my life purpose? I was very serious back then. I was thinking of leaving academics. I was a tenured full professor. It's a really big decision. You can't get the job back once you leave. And so I wanted to know, what's my life purpose? And this is what we're doing. I have that question. We're out there jumping around like a happy dolphin. And we came back, and I stepped out of the dolphin. I said, that was really fun, but what about my question? What's my life purpose? And this is the answer I got. You got a life purpose. Gave me a pun. And, I just don't think I could have made that one up. And I got the message. The message was lighten up. Don't worry about it. Right? So sometimes you get an answer you don't expect. Now, the most profound healing I've ever had in my life was around my father. I had a difficult time with my father growing up. From my perspective now, I know he was traumatized in World War II. He's very explosive, which is typical of PTSD. Really scared me a lot. And so I did a journey. I was doing an exercise called Dialogue with the Dead. It was actually during hypnotherapy, but it was just like a shamanic journey. And in Dialogue with the Dead, you do a journey to someone who has died so you can have a conversation with them. And so I decided to journey to my father, since I did 20 years of psychotherapy about my father. And, it helped some, but I'm still having all this conflict. My father died when I was 18, when they die young, you always think you're going to resolve things, and it doesn't happen, right? So I journeyed to him, and he shows up in a samurai warrior outfit like this, right? That was kind of a surprise. And we were actually sitting down, and he was telling me very calmly about how I'd chosen him to be my father for the life I was going to live, and, all this kind of thing. And I thought, yeah, well, that's kind of helpful. And then he turned into this little boy. I'm sorry. He suddenly turned into this beautiful little boy like this, and he crawls into my arms. He says, "This is the only way you're ever going to love me." And all my father issues completely disappeared. I've never had a bad feeling about my father since. I mean, and that took like 20 minutes. 20 years of therapy and 20 minutes in a journey. I'm sure the therapy helped prepare me for this, but still, that was quite profound. I've never had a bad thought about my father since. It's just amazing. I just feel like I love my father. And so, you can get these really profound things happening. Now, we do shamanic healing, and the things in shamanism, we're either taking things out or putting things in, right? We take out energies don't belong in the body, we're bringing things back in. It's kind of spatial that way. This Peruvian shamanism, we actually work with the energy body. We're working with chakras. They have chakras in Peru. I was really surprised to find that out, And we actually clear them, and then we illuminate them with light that heals the energy body. The energy body you can think of as like a blueprint for your body. And we also extract things, energies that don't belong in the body. There can be these things that look like spears and things which can turn into illness. The other thing we can remove, sometimes ghosts, as we see them, can attach to people. It can be an illness, and it can cause bad behavior and all sorts of things. So we can remove those. And we do it in a way where we are healing the attached spirit. We actually remove them and send them into the light. And then we can have power loss, which we all have power animals, which supply us with life energy. If you lose one of them, you can have just really bad luck. Your life becomes a country western song, right? You lose your house and your wife and your dog and your pickup. That's kind of like power loss. And the really big healing we do is soul retrieval. And this is found in virtually all indigenous cultures, is when you have a trauma or something difficult happens or a difficult time in your life, part of you goes away, usually just to be in a nice place so it doesn't have to be here. You see a truck's coming to hit your car, it's like, why all be here? A bunch of you goes off to be in a nice place. In a indigenous culture, they would do a soul retrieval in a few days and bring that back so you'd be whole again. But in our culture, we don't usually do that. So you end up just losing parts of yourself. It can lead to depression, illness, all sorts of things, or feelings of just not being here. You hear the words of soul loss all the time, like I have a hole in my heart, I haven't been the same since the accident, things like that. And that's the most profound things I've seen changing. When we do soul retrieval for people, their lives really change. And we don't diagnose from symptoms, we diagnose from spiritual information. So in shamanism, we typically do a shamanic journey, or now that I've been doing this over 10 years, I can actually get the information directly intuitive, more like a psychic. But don't call me a psychic. I still haven't gotten over that yet. I'm still a scientist, I'll heal that one and they'll be all right, huh? So after my first soul retrieval, I was able to draw beautifully. These are drawings I made. And this just kind of came out of the blue. And, there was a soul part brought back when I was 10 years old, when I used to draw then. And I gave it up because I was pretty self-critical and didn't really have support in my family. And no one was more surprised than me that I just kept drawing all these beautiful drawings. Now, healing I've done from other people, I'm going to tell you about a few remarkable cases. So I do a lot of remote healing, which is really edgy for someone who used to be a scientist. I'm just at home. I'm not in contact with the person at all. I tell them when I'm doing it. And consistently, things happen, And so I did a remote healing on the 21-year-old son of one of my clients. He had problems, ADHD, drugs, alcohol, got in trouble a lot. He was in a family of overachievers. He was kind of the black sheep. And I did a journey for him and found it. And what I sensed was his last life, he died at the Baja 1000, which is this race that goes down the link to Baja, California. And so here's some pictures from that. And that I found part of his soul in the bottom of a canyon where he'd crashed and brought it back. and brought it back into him. So not only did all these problems with ADHD, drugs, alcohol, and getting in trouble go away, he became a race car driver. That's pretty remarkable, right? And I'd never met him. I just did one session. Another one, I did a remote healing. My assistant in my training had a niece who was in the hospital in critical care with Crohn's disease, the 12-year-olds. That's usually a disease older people get, it's a colon disease. And she couldn't really work on her niece because she's too close to her. It's very hard to do healing work on your family members. And so she called me. Her sister actually asked me to do the healing. Now her sister was a complete non-believer in this stuff, but she was desperate. So I did a remote healing. Over the hour and a half I was doing the healing, all her vital signs came up, and at the end she was sitting up and smiling and talking to people. So she got a lot better during the healing, but her mother really wanted to know, why did she have Crohn's disease and how can she heal it? And so I got, the information I got is the girl was giving excessive antibiotics when she was 2 years old for ear infections, which turned out to be correct. Again, that was verified. How she can heal it, this was a little bit difficult to say, and I have to give all sorts of caveats. I don't give medical advice. But I said, this is actually a disease that was caused by medicine. You actually need to leave Western medicine, see a naturopath. And she did, and they did some things that comes out of Germany, and 3 years later, last I heard, her daughter was absolutely fine. So, and this is somebody I never met either. Just did one session. There are other things. I was clearing a house is one of the things we do, is we clear houses. Sometimes they have ghosts or bad energies in them. And my assistant was with me, and part of what we did is we sat down in the middle of the house and we drummed, and we both did a journey to find out what was going on. And we came back and talked, and we had the exact same journey. And that was, there were a couple of Native American spirits there. The buffalo showed up. It led us into the upper world to their homeland, and they went. But it was exactly the same experience, which was kind of interesting. I did a remote healing for a child who was getting all sorts of bad experiences in her bedroom, which you might call a ghost. And I did a remote healing. I told them when I was doing, but not what time of the day. But as soon as I crossed over this old man that used to live in the house, and we sent them into the light. And I emailed her, and right away I got an email back, and she says, just when you crossed them over, there's a bright light came in the room at exactly that time. And then one of the things we do when we do spirit releasement, where we're removing a ghost from somebody, we actually send hot energy down their spine. And I do this sometimes remotely. I'm just doing a healing for people. I don't tell them what I'm going to do. And there are 2 times I was doing a spirit releasement for people remotely. So I'm just at home doing this. And both of them said, about that time I felt my spine heat up. That's a very odd thing to say, right? But that's actually what we do. We send heat down the spine to get the ghost to release. So it's nice to get this sort of feedback on these sorts of things. Then manifesting is a very interesting thing. In my training I do here, the last part is actually manifesting. And still being a skeptical scientist, I'm always surprised when it happens. But the first one I did was a nice fleece top I wanted, that color, and I wanted a little zipper in the side, and I wanted the pockets to come together. I don't know why, I was so specific, a nice fleece. And there's a very nice little secondhand thrift store in Lafayette, and I went in there, and there it was. And it was brand new from REI, cost $7. And that was pretty amazing, but I'm still skeptical. I thought it's just a coincidence. So I get home, I put it on, put my hands in the pocket, and there's $6 in cash. So sort of the universe gives me these messages a couple of times. And then I got this nice little inexpensive sports car. I just got online, there it was 5 miles away at a really good price. I got a very nice apartment way below market value here in Lafayette. I moved here a year ago. This walking stick I really liked because it used to be in our other building before we moved here, and then it disappeared because there was a renter who didn't pay his rent or something. I don't know. Anyway, it was gone. And I was thinking one day I'd really like a walking stick like that. And within a few days I come in, and Holly, who's the director here, she says, would you like this walking stick? It was the exact stick, So I thought, well, that was pretty interesting. And I also wanted a snake made out of serpentine. I used to do research on serpentine. It's a California state rock. And then my assistant out of the blue said, "I think the snake is for you." And just gave it to me. So when you really get good at manifesting, you don't even have to buy them anymore, right? They just, people give them to you. It's kind of nice. Now the synchronicities are one of the most fascinating things. So this is one of the weirdest ones I ever had. So a couple of years ago, I went and saw my sister in Florida, and they live near these lakes that have alligators. So in the morning we go out, and we're walking on this walkway, wooden walkway above the edge of the lake. And up comes this alligator with a fish in its mouth. The alligator was looking right at us, and I swear the catfish was looking at us too. I don't know. Anyway, it suddenly flipped the catfish around lengthwise and swallowed it whole. And my sister said, "Well, we've never seen anything like that. We've never seen an alligator with a fish in its mouth." So I thought, well, that's kind of interesting, right? Now, traditional shaman would tell you that's a sign, right? But we skeptical scientists go, well, maybe it is, you know. So what happens is we go home, and I turn on the TV, and they have satellite TV with 150 channels or whatever. And what comes on, I turn the TV, what comes on is a special on alligators. Not only was it on alligators, it was about how alligators catch their fish like this, and they flip them around and swallow them lengthwise. Exactly what we'd seen. Now, roughly statistics, I calculate that's over a 1 in a million chance. I just happen to turn on TV and out of all those stations and see exactly the same thing. So it's very interesting about people tend to be called to shamanism, just like I was. It's like, and Richard Stromer, who does our birth charts for so many of my students, he says over and over, most of my students actually have this shamanic thing in their chart. There's a very distinctive pattern. I can't exactly recall what it is, but my chart's this very shamanic type of thing. He says 70% have the sort of shamanic chart, and the other 30% have a mystical chart. Way above chance that these people have these same sorts of charts. So when people feel drawn to it, it's probably because it's in your life destiny. It's a healing path. It's also kind of the path of the wounded healer. So most people that do shamanic training have had a pretty tough life, but from a shamanic point of view, you kind of chose to have that life. You need to have those difficulties and heal them to be able to be good at healing. And so if you're interested, a really nice way to start is a weekend workshop in shamanism, which is coming up here January 21st and 22nd. That's a really nice introduction. It's very similar to the weekend workshop I took that really changed my life. Longer term training, I teach an 8 or a 16-month shamanic training program. We actually teach practitioners, but some people take it just for their personal growth. We have a lot of good times in that. And then I have a monthly shamanic group. You're welcome to come here every month on the third, usually it's the third Sunday. And I have a meetup group, a Bay Area Shamanism meetup, if you want to get reminders about that. And when you do that, you can meet what we call your power animal, right? Which is one of your main helping spirits. So see that guy over there? He's actually literally hugging a tiger. But you can meet them in the spirit world. And this 8 to 16 months training is quite profound because it involves doing your own healing so you can become a good healer. And so in the first directions, the south, you can start in the south or west, but the south, it's about healing the stories you know about, our life stories, our woundings. And you learn this illumination technique, which is chakra clearing, and things like power animal retrieval, which is restoring power. The West is very deep work. It's what we call shadow work. Shadow is the part of you deny exists, but we project it out into the world. So everything you see out there you hate is really kind of part of you you're denying. But we do it in a way that's very interesting and sometimes even entertaining. And all this sort of work is about self-love. But the shadow, by definition, is what we don't love. So we need to bring it up and reclaim it and learn to love it and get that power back. So you kind of become it's like being a peaceful warrior. We might repress the warrior because we don't want to be violent in things, but you reclaim that power and you realize you can handle it and you can choose to be peaceful. In the North, we're letting go of the ego. The ego is simply a mental construct of who we think we are. It's a made-up thing, right? And we can learn to let that go and take it on whenever we want. you probably already know when you're around your parents, you have one identity, and when you're around your kids, another, and when you're around your lover, it's another. We learn to do that, to shift those very consciously. But who we are is actually the one that makes up all those different characters, right? Which is sort of doesn't have form, you know. So it's letting go of this idea of who we are. And then we learn the soul retrieval technique, which is so powerful in healing. And then the last part's reclaiming what's your destiny? What'd you come here for? So we all come here with some purpose. And then also we teach about how to manifest. And much of learning to manifest is getting out of our own way. We don't believe we can, or we think we're not good enough, or you may think you want success, but part of you may be scared of being successful. You know, so we resolve those conflicts and learn to actually manifest things in the world. And we do all the teaching here at the HCH Institute, which has been around about 30 years. But I started the shamanic program here about 6 years ago. All right, well, thank you for coming. Really appreciate you being here. Okay.